And that year, my mom put me in Athens to do half cyber school and half of the brick and mortar school. So when I got there, I remember my first day being there and hearing these 10 and 11-year-olds swear, and I'm like, oh, this is terrible. And so, but then I started getting friends, and I noticed that the kids at school treated me so much better than the kids at church. And then I grew up learning about Jesus, and I knew all the stories. I knew all the right answers, and that's probably why I thought that I had been saved, because I did pray that prayer, but I didn't know what that meant. And so I was like, after starting at Athens and noticing the difference, I was like, well, I don't really think church is all that cool, because if this is how I'm being treated at church, then I don't really want to have anything to do with these people. So I remember telling my mom endless amount of times, I don't want to go to church. I don't. And I did that for years. And during those years of middle school and junior high, I made a lot of bad choices. I had a lot of friends that weren't great. I had a lot of relationships that weren't great, and unfortunately, I learned from just going to public school how terrible some guys can be, which was really rough. And then once I was in high school, let me back up a little bit. In junior high, my house burned down. And so that was a really hard time for me and my family. But I realized that God didn't have to save me. I could have died that day, but I didn't. So that was in the back of my head, but I still wasn't quite convinced that I needed Jesus. And a few years later, I've had concussions, countless concussions. But my freshman year of high school, that was when I got my really bad concussion. And I was put on bed rest for like 3 months. I was in and out of school. I had speech therapy, eye therapy. It was really rough. And I had volleyball taken away from me. I had a lot of things taken away. And so I had a lot of time to think about things. And I had been in a relationship, I think it was maybe my second year. Some of you may know him, Parker. And that wasn't the greatest relationship either. Some of it was very mentally and emotionally abusing. And after dating someone for a while, you're like, oh, how do I get out of here? I'm stuck. So I kept dating him. But then we started going to Independent because I had some friends that went there, and they're like, oh, it's great, you'll love it. So I started going to youth group there, and for the first time, I remember listening to what Pastor Mike was saying. And I was like, man, Jesus sounds like a real cool dude. I should get to know him better.
So what was it, do you think, that made the difference for you? You said, before, when you were kind of involved with the youth group and that kind of thing before, with the other kids at church, there was just this attitude of, you realized that they weren't treating you really well from the kids' perspective, obviously, which really highlights exactly what Jesus says when he says, you're to love one another, and this is how people will know that you're my disciples, that if you love one another. Well, if a church isn't a loving place to be, we're actually proving that we're not disciples of Christ, So, obviously that kind of plays into exactly what you're saying. But what was the main difference when you started going there and listening to this teaching? What was distinct about it?
Everyone there had this passion. They were happy. They loved seeing me come. They were like, hey, let's do this outside of youth group. And I didn't really have that before. They took the time to build that relationship, whereas the others didn't.
So they weren't just people you went to church with. They wanted to be your friend as well. Good.
Yeah.
Excellent. So God used that time in your life, really, and even the relationships that you were building. And so how did God continue to use that to bring you to the place where you really surrendered to Christ?
Well, I don't remember exactly what Mike was talking about, but I remember, and I had a lot of mentors. I started actually going to the church and the other services too, and there was a lot of adults there that really helped me grow into the person I am today. And I remember talking to one of my closest friends. We don't talk much, unfortunately, but Billy Joe, she really encouraged me to start living for Christ. And I started reevaluating things that I was doing, the people I was talking to, and my relationship that I was having. And finally I got to the point where I was just like, I don't want to live like this anymore. I want Jesus to be in my heart. I want him to rule over, and I want to submit to him. And the moment that I realized I had to do that, I ended my relationship with Parker. I started making an effort to show that I wanted God first. And I changed a lot of things in my life. And let me tell you, there's nothing more satisfying than the peace that comes with listening to Jesus and following him and not looking back. And I will never forget that feeling, and I still have that feeling. And since then, I have pursued to follow him and make that known to other people around me.
If you were going to point to just maybe one or two of the most significant ways you think God has changed you from a heart that really wanted to rule itself to a heart that is submitted to his rule, what would be the one or two areas that you would point to?
You want to rephrase that question?
What is the one area you would point to?
One area.
Just one. Doesn't have to be the biggest one, but just one area that you say, this is one area in which I really desired to rebel against God, but God has really, since that true conversion, really brought me to the place where I am willing to submit that to him.
Probably control. I get it from my dad sometimes. I like to micromanage things. And so when things aren't exactly how I think they should be, I'm like, oh, I have to. And sometimes I still do struggle with that. It's a constant.
And folks, she's planning a wedding.
I have to stop and remember that I don't have to control everything. And I don't have to worry about the things that I'm not in control of. And that was one of the biggest things that I had to really work on. And like, things that we struggle with is a constant battle. We can't just be like, oh, we're better now, and walk away. It comes back. So just continually working on that.
That's great. Thank you very much for sharing. I did have one thing that I was supposed to do this morning, and I neglected because there was we were doing a lot.